Hi, my name is Holly Whitney, and for our final research paper I did flipped mastery. One of the reasons that I chose to do this was because I wrote a grant with two science teachers to flip two of their science classrooms. And they started out with just traditional flipped classroom, and they eventually, both of them independently, sort of morphed into a flipped mastery classroom. So I wanted to do a little more research about it. So what is mastery? Mastery actually is really old. Bloom wrote a lot about it in the 1970s, and his idea was that all students can learn, and given enough time and support. So his idea was that you organized your curriculum into these learning units, and you started off with very high quality instruction, and you had a first formative assessment to see where all of your students were. After that, you looked at where they were based on the formative assessment that you did, and you identified what each student needed. And then you gave explicit targeted suggestions for each of those students. And then you reassessed when you were done to see whether or not you actually were successful. And you gave enrichment for students that got it immediately. So you gave them maybe deeper content. This worked. Classrooms that implemented it and did it well, they could show that their students were learning and that they were learning at a very high level. However, it was very difficult to implement. The teacher had to repeat lessons over and over and over again based on where their students were. You had to have different assessments, so many different assessments to be able to teach students. And students were always at different places in your classroom. So you might have a few that were ahead, a few that were behind, and it was just kind of chaotic. So it was very, very difficult to implement. Then along came the flipped classroom. And this was the idea that you would watch your lessons at home. So in traditional instruction, teacher standing at the front of the classroom was done at home. And so the students would go home, watch that, and then they would come in the next day ready to learn and work with the actual support of the teacher. And the value of a teacher to students is that interactive personal mentoring. And some of the research I found showed that there was some improvement in an economy classroom in college. He did some numbers, and there was improvement. But there was still, most flipped classrooms were, they would do things in a unit and whole class instruction. So when students didn't learn, we still moved on, even though they didn't get it. And we all know that students are in very different places in their learning. Some get it really quickly, some take more time, some take more support. But we still treated them as a group. So what happens if we combine the two? And then we have flipped mastery. And this allowed us to be able to use the technology so that teachers didn't have to give instructions many, many times. You could just do it on a video, send it home, and students could watch that part at home when they were ready. And traditional flipped mastery is split up into three sections. You have your learning objectives, so what your students need to learn. Your learning objects, which are the actual physical objects that students use to be able to reach those objectives. And then you have a list of required activities. And this is a list that guides the students through their learning for each of the units. Usually most teachers use it as a checklist. Start here, do this, accomplish that, do this assessment, do this lab. And that's how teachers traditionally do it. And the teachers that I interviewed, they felt that it was a better way to challenge students, and that it allowed some students to get deeper into the content and allowed them to be able to support the students who needed more support. So some of the pros with this is that higher student achievement. The research I did and the interviews I did showed that students were able to achieve at a higher level. It allowed students to become more engaged in their learning. They actually had to be. They couldn't just sit in the back of the classroom, listen to the teacher, take the tests, do the homework. They actually had to be part of the learning, which is how students then need to take more responsibility for their own learning. They had their checklist. They were in charge of their own destiny. They had to go from thing to thing. So they were responsible. It's also easier for a teacher to be able to differentiate a classroom. Because you do so much one-on-one work with students, you give each student exactly what it is that they need, which is, as you know, an ever-changing thing. It gives students instant feedback from the teacher. So when the students were done with what they need to do on their checklist, they showed the teacher either checked it off or gave suggestions of things that they needed to complete or fix. It prompts a dialogue between teachers and students. There's always those students that will sit in the back of the class, listen to the lesson, do their homework, come in, get good grades, and they don't really talk to the teacher. In a flipped classroom, a FlippedMastery, that really can't happen because the students need to interact with the teacher. Here, I'm done with this. What can I do? So if a teacher notices that they're getting it quickly, they can give them deeper, more challenging things to do. Or if they're struggling, then they can face that at that time. It encourages students to be self-motivated. They have their list. They need to know what they have what they need to know to do next. So it allows them to be able to progress at a level or in a way that makes sense to them, and that often motivates students. And again, they're responsible for their own learning. Of course, this isn't a fix-all. There's always going to be challenges in the classroom. And one of the biggest challenges that my two teachers found was dealing with a traditional school calendar. Because quarters ended, because trimesters ended, your classrooms are set up so that you have assignments for every single student. And if your students are learning at a different rate, then when the trimester ended, you might have students who hadn't completed it. And it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but your grade book sort of treats it that way. So you have to figure out how to deal with that. In the research I did, some teachers would actually end the unit for all students, but allowed students to progress through that unit at a different rate. Some students would go deeper into the content, which would take them longer to be able to compensate for students that took longer time to learn material. Students who are behind. You're always going to have those students who are falling behind, and how do you deal with that? Also, less motivated students. There tends to be less of them in a flipped classroom because you give so much control back to students, and typically students who are not motivated, it comes from lack of control. So now that students do have that control, they tend to be more motivated. But it's not a fix-all. You're still going to have students who are not interested in being motivated and struggle to stay organized. Some students found it very difficult to have to be in control of their own checklists and steps. And so those students continue to struggle being organized. And actually, it's a great learning experience for them. So some of these cons actually, in the end up fixing themselves. The two teachers that I interviewed say that they'll never go back to a traditional classroom. The whole idea of being able to teach students at the level that they need and to be able to meet their needs, they can't imagine going back to standing in the front of the classroom and lecturing students. So thanks for watching. These are my sources, and